What if the most terrifying presence in your home wasn't a ghost, but the patient, silent stranger who has been living in your attic for days, listening to your every breath, waiting for the perfect moment to descend? This isn't the premise of a film. It is the chilling reality that anchored the last days of the Gruber family on their remote German farmstead, Hinterkaifeck. The year was 1922. The world was recovering from one war, blissfully unaware of the horrors brewing for the next. But on this isolated patch of Bavarian land, a private, far more intimate horror was about to unfold. One that would leave 6 people brutally murdered, and a nation haunted by a crime that to this day remains a gaping wound of unanswered questions. The story of Hinterkaifeck doesn't begin with a scream, but with a series of quiet, unnerving whispers from the periphery of a family's life. Small, inexplicable events that, when pieced together, paint a portrait of a predator methodically closing in on its prey. The truth of what happened is far more disturbing than any fiction, because it reminds us that the creak in the floorboards upstairs might not be the house settling. It might be someone shifting their weight, listening. The farm itself was an island, cut off from the nearest village by a thick swathe of forest. Hinterkaifeck wasn't just a name. It was a description of its profound isolation. Here lived the Gruber family, the stern patriarch Andreas and his wife Cecilia, their widowed daughter Victoria Gabriel, and her 2 young children, 7-year-old Cecilia and 2-year-old Joseph. The 6th and final resident was the new maid, Maria Baumgartner, who arrived on the very day the horror would begin. Their lives were dictated by the rhythm of the seasons and the demands of the land, a predictable cycle of hard work and quiet evenings. But that predictability had been shattered in the months leading up to that final, fateful Friday in March. Strange occurrences had begun to fray the edges of their reality. Andreas, a man not given to flights of fancy, had become increasingly agitated, confessing to neighbors that he believed the farm was haunted. But the presence he felt was not spectral. It was something tangible, something that left physical traces of its intrusion, a chilling prelude to the violence that would soon consume them all. Have you ever lost your keys? The frustration, the brief panic, followed by the relief of finding them in an unexpected pocket. Now imagine that feeling, but stretched over days, escalating in its strangeness. This was Andreas Gruber's reality. Weeks before the murders, a set of house keys vanished without a trace. He searched everywhere, accusing everyone and no one, the mystery gnawing at him. Then, just as inexplicably, they reappeared. But the unease didn't fade. Soon after, he discovered a newspaper in his home, one he had never purchased, from a city he had never visited. It was a Munich paper, left as if for him to find. Who had brought it? How had they entered the locked house? These weren't simple, forgetful mistakes. They were deliberate acts, calculated to unsettle, to announce a presence without showing a face. Each incident was a small tear in the fabric of their secure world, a quiet declaration from an unseen intruder. I can come and go as I please. I can watch you. I am already inside. The sense of violation must have been suffocating, turning every shadow and every silence into a potential threat. The most unnerving discovery came from the snow. One morning, Andreas awoke to a fresh blanket of white covering his property. And there, leading from the densest part of the forest, was a single set of footprints. They walked directly to the back of the farmhouse and stopped. There were no corresponding prints leading away. It was as if a man had simply materialized from the woods and been swallowed by the walls of the house. Andreas, armed and terrified, searched every inch of the property, the barn, the sheds, the house itself. He found nothing. No broken locks, no forced windows, no one hiding in the hayloft. But the footprints were undeniable proof. Someone had been there. Perhaps he must have realized with a cold dread. Someone was still there. This event marked a turning point. The quiet unease curdled into palpable fear. The family was no longer just unsettled. They were being stalked. The locks on their doors suddenly felt useless. Their isolation no longer a comfort, but a terrifying vulnerability. What would you have done in that moment? Would you flee, leaving everything behind? Or would you barricade yourself inside, hoping the threat would simply disappear? The nights that followed were filled with a new kind of terror. The family began hearing noises from the attic, footsteps, muffled sounds, the creak of old floorboards bearing an unfamiliar weight. Andreas would climb the ladder, his heart pounding in his chest, only to find the attic empty, the dust undisturbed. Yet the sounds persisted. They became a part of the house's nightly symphony, a horrifying accompaniment to the wind whistling through the eaves. It suggests a killer of unimaginable patience, living above them, sharing their home. learning their routines. He would have heard their dinner conversations, the lullabies Victoria sang to her children, the arguments, the laughter. He would have smelled their food cooking. They were living their lives completely oblivious to the man breathing the same air, separated only by a few inches of wood and plaster. The psychological torment of such a presence, even if only suspected, is immense. It turns your sanctuary into a cage you share with a predator. Every creak, every groan of the old farmhouse would have sent a fresh spike of adrenaline through their veins, leaving them in a perpetual state of high alert, exhausted and terrified. Maria Baumgartner arrived at Hinterkaifeck on the afternoon of Friday, March 31st, 1922. It was her first day as the new maid. The previous maid had quit 6 months prior. Fleeing in terror and claiming the house was haunted, she spoke of the same disembodied footsteps, the same chilling sense of being watched. Maria, perhaps desperate for work or simply more pragmatic, dismissed the stories. She walked onto the farmstead, a place already steeped in a silent, creeping dread, and into the final act of a tragedy. She would not even survive her first night. Her arrival marks the final piece falling into place for the killer. With a full house, the predator in the attic decided it was time to act. It is a haunting detail that Maria's own family would later report. She had felt an immediate sense of foreboding upon arriving, as if the very air on the farm was thick with malice. One can only imagine her unpacking her few belongings in her small room, perhaps hearing the same strange noises from above and trying to rationalize them, unaware that her fate, and the fate of the entire family, had already been sealed. The method of the slaughter speaks to a chilling level of planning and brutality. The police would later theorize that the killer lured each family member, one by one, into the barn. They believe it started with Victoria, her daughter Cecilia, and her parents, Andreas and Cecilia. The weapon of choice was a mattock, a heavy farming tool similar to a pickaxe, which belonged to the Grubers themselves. The killer used their own tool to end their lives. The scene inside that barn must have been an unimaginable tableau of horror. The victims were dispatched with savage, crushing blows to the head. The killer's rage, or perhaps his cold efficiency, was evident in the sheer violence of the act. The element of deception is what is most disturbing. How do you convince 4 people to enter a barn late at night without raising an alarm that alerts the others? Did he call to them, feigning an emergency with the livestock? Did he confront one and their scream brought the next? The silence of the farm, its greatest vulnerability, meant no one could hear them, no one could help. After systematically eliminating the adults and the older child in the barn, the killer then moved from the cold darkness of the barn into the relative warmth and light of the farmhouse. There, 2 innocents remained. 2-year-old Joseph, sleeping peacefully in his cot in his mother's bedroom, and the new maid Maria, in her own quarters. The same mattock that had been used in the barn was brought inside the home. The killer entered their rooms and, with the same brutal efficiency, ended their lives as they slept. The murder of little Joseph is a particularly gut-wrenching detail. Police reports noted that tufts of his own hair were found clutched in his tiny, dead hands, suggesting he may have been conscious, terrified in his final moments. What kind of human being is capable of such an act? To not only murder a family but to extinguish the life of a sleeping toddler with a heavy farm tool. This was not a crime of passion. This was an extermination, carried out with a cold, methodical purpose that defies all human comprehension. The house, once a home, was now a silent tomb. But the story does not end there. In fact, this is where it descends into a new level of the bizarre and the terrifying. The killer did not flee after the murders. He stayed. For several days, this unknown individual lived in the house with the 6 bodies he had just massacred. He tended to the cattle, feeding and watering them. He ate food from the kitchen, cooked meals for himself. Neighbors reported seeing smoke rising from the chimney of the Hinterkaifeck farmhouse. Throughout the weekend, the farm dog was found tied up but unharmed, apparently cared for by the murderer. This is the detail that elevates the case from a horrific crime to something almost mythic in its strangeness. What does this tell us about the killer's mindset? Let us know your theories in the comments. Was this an act of grotesque domesticity? A victory lap? Or was he simply a man with nowhere else to go? A ghost who had finally taken possession of the house? He had haunted from the attic? The discovery of the crime was as strange as the events leading up to it. Several days passed. Young Cecilia failed to show up for school. The family missed church on Sunday. These were small anomalies, but in a tight-knit rural community they were noticed. The postman noted that the mail he had delivered on Saturday was still untouched on Monday. Finally, on Tuesday, April 4th, A group of neighbors, led by Lorenz Schlittenbauer, decided to investigate. The farm was eerily silent. The dog barked from inside the barn. There was no answer at the door. They made their way to the barn, and upon forcing the door open, they were met with a scene of absolute horror. The bodies of Andreas, Cecilia, Victoria, and young Cecilia were piled together, partially covered with hay. The stark reality of the violence, the smell of death hanging heavy in the air, sent them reeling back into the daylight, their minds struggling to process the carnage they had just witnessed. The search party then moved to the house. Inside, the silence was profound, unnatural. They moved from room to room, the floorboards groaning under their weight. In Maria Baumgartner's bedroom, they found her body in her bed, her life extinguished on her very first night of employment. In Victoria's room, they found the most heartbreaking sight of all, little Joseph dead in his cot. The entire family wiped out, yet, amidst the horror, there were signs of the killer's continued presence. The beds looked as though they had been slept in recently. Food had been eaten from the pantry. The entire farm had been maintained. The police were called, and one of the largest murder investigations in German history began. The scene was a confounding puzzle. It was a place of extreme violence, yet also of eerie calm. The killer had treated the farm as his own home after committing the ultimate act of violation. Within its walls, the investigation was immediately chaotic. In the 1920s, forensic science was in its infancy. The scene was contaminated, not only by the well-meaning neighbors, but also by the sheer number of curious locals who flocked to the farm after the news broke. Despite this, investigators began to piece together a profile of the killer. The motive did not appear to be robbery. A large sum of cash was found untouched in the house. This suggested the motive was personal, an act of revenge or extreme hatred directed at the Gruber family. Rumors swirled through the community. Andreas Gruber was known to be a difficult, even tyrannical man. There were whispers of incest between him and his daughter Victoria, and many believed that little Joseph was the product of their illicit relationship, a secret the family guarded fiercely. Could this dark secret have been the catalyst for the massacre? Did someone seek to punish the family for their sins? Over the years, more than 100 suspects were questioned, but no one was ever charged. The list of potential killers was long and varied. There were jilted lovers of Victoria, including Lorenz Schlittenbauer himself, the neighbor who led the search party and whose behavior was often considered suspicious. There were drifters and vagrants known to pass through the area. Some even theorized it could have been Victoria's husband, Carl Gabriel, who was officially reported as killed in the trenches of World War I. Some witnesses claimed to have seen him after the war, and a theory emerged that he had returned to find his wife with a child from her own father, snapping and killing everyone in a jealous rage. Yet for every theory there was a counter-argument, an alibi, a lack of definitive proof. The killer remained a phantom, a faceless specter who had emerged from the forest and vanished back into it, leaving only bloodshed and questions in his wake. One of the most chilling artifacts of the case came years later. The skulls of the victims were sent to Munich for examination by clairvoyants, a testament to the desperation of the investigators. The autopsies had already confirmed death by blunt force trauma, but the skulls were never returned to the family graves. They were lost amidst the chaos of World War II, a final, bizarre chapter in the family's tragic story. Without the skulls, the bodies were buried headless in the Weidhofen Cemetery, where a monument now stands to their memory. The missing skulls serve as a grim metaphor for the case itself. A story without a head, without a conclusion, without the identity of the monster who perpetrated it. The mystery is as much a part of the Hinterkaifeck legacy as the murders themselves. What does it mean for a crime of this magnitude to go unsolved? It creates a vacuum, which is quickly filled by folklore, ghost stories, and morbid fascination. The Hinterkaifeck farm was torn down in 1923, less than a year after the murders. The locals, it seemed, wanted to erase the physical scar from their landscape, but you cannot demolish a memory. The story of the family, murdered by an unknown killer who lived in their home, has seeped into the very soil of that region. It has become a cautionary tale, a legend whispered around fires. It serves as a stark reminder of the darkness that can lie hidden just beyond the tree line, just beyond the perceived safety of our own locked doors. The lack of resolution is in itself a form of terror. It means the monster was never caught. He lived out his life, perhaps as a quiet neighbor in another town, carrying the secret of his monstrous act to his own grave. Think about the killer's psychology. To live in such close proximity to his future victims requires a Complete absence of empathy, a level of predatory patience that is almost inhuman. He would have become intimately familiar with their lives, transforming them from people into mere objects, targets for the violence he planned to unleash. He wasn't an outsider who struck at random. He was an insider, a parasite who had burrowed his way into the heart of their home. This premeditation is what makes the crime so uniquely horrifying. He didn't just want them dead. It seems he wanted to briefly possess their lives, to inhabit their space before and after snuffing them out. It's a level of psychological violation that transcends the physical act of murder, leaving a stain that can never be washed away. Could something like Hinterkaifeck happen today? With modern forensics, security cameras, and instant communication, it seems less likely. But the core of the story, the terror of a home invasion by a silent, patient intruder, is timeless. It preys on our most fundamental fears, the fear of the dark, the fear of the unknown, and the fear that our safest space is not safe at all. The story forces us to confront the terrifying possibility that evil doesn't always announce itself with a crash or a scream. Sometimes it slips in through an unlocked door or an open window and waits. It listens from the attic. It walks in our hallways while we sleep. The horror of Hinterkaifeck is not that it is a mystery, but that it is a possibility. The files on the Hinterkaifeck murders were officially closed in 1955, but the case has been reopened and re-examined by police and amateur sleuths multiple times. Most recently in 2007 by students of a German police academy. They used modern investigative techniques to re-evaluate the evidence, but even they could not definitively name a suspect. They did, however, come to a consensus on a single person they believe was the most likely perpetrator, but out of respect for living relatives, they have never publicly released the name, and so the mystery endures. The name of the killer remains a secret, locked away in a modern police report, a final, tantalizing piece of an unsolvable puzzle. The final lingering question is perhaps the most unsettling. Who was he? Was he a neighbor, driven by a dark secret? A returning soldier broken by war? Or was he something else entirely? A nameless drifter? A human monster who found in the isolation of Hinterkaifeck the perfect canvas upon which to paint his masterpiece of terror? The footprints in the snow that led from the forest but never led away feel symbolic. He was a man who came from the dark wilderness, from the unknown, and after his brutal work was done, he was swallowed by the world again, leaving behind nothing but a legacy of fear. He became, in effect, the ghost the previous mate had feared, a specter of violence that haunts German history. So the next time you are home alone and you hear an unfamiliar noise from upstairs, when a floorboard creaks or a shadow moves just at the edge of your vision, remember the Gruber family. Remember the footprints in the snow. Remember the patient, silent watcher in the attic of Hinterkaifeck. And ask yourself, are you truly alone in your house? The silence that follows that question can be the most terrifying sound of all. If you have ever had a strange, unexplainable experience in your own home, a feeling that you weren't alone, share your story below. You might find you are not the only one.